Nina Garrett had learned to keep her head down. At 38, she worked the morning shift at Ridgeline Corporate Training Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, restocking supplies, setting up conference rooms, and keeping the facility running smoothly. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet woman who arrived early, never complained, and always volunteered for the tasks no one else wanted. What they didn't know was that the calm in her eyes came from years of making life-or-death decisions under pressure, and the steadiness in her hands had once guided aircraft worth millions of dollars onto carrier decks in the middle of storms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nina's apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex 15 minutes from work. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph she kept face down in her bedroom drawer. In it, a younger version of herself stood in full Navy dress uniform, her chest decorated with ribbons and medals that told stories she never shared. Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett, Naval Aviator. 12 years of service, 3 deployments, over 200 carrier landings, a commendation for valor that came with a memory she'd spent the last 4 years trying to forget. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any mission briefing prepared her for. The structure, the purpose, the brotherhood of the military, none of it translated to the corporate world where she now found herself. After her medical retirement following a training accident that shattered her left leg in 4 places, Nina had drifted through various jobs: warehouse work, retail management, administrative assistant positions that lasted a few months before the restlessness drove her elsewhere. Ridgeline Corporate Training Center seemed like a good fit, or at least a quiet one. The facility hosted leadership seminars, management training programs, and corporate team-building events for companies across the Southeast. Nina's role as facilities coordinator meant she worked behind the scenes, invisible to the executives and consultants who filled the conference rooms. She preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety. It meant no questions about the limp she still carried on cold mornings, no awkward conversations about why someone with her education and background was restocking coffee supplies. Her typical day began at 5:30 in the morning. She'd arrived before the sun rose, checking that conference rooms were properly arranged, ensuring audio-visual equipment functioned correctly, and preparing welcome packets for incoming training groups. By the time the actual trainers and corporate clients arrived around 8, Nina had usually completed most of her work and could retreat to the supply areas and maintenance corridors that formed her domain. The other facility staff were friendly enough, though they kept their distance. Frank Morales, the evening maintenance supervisor, occasionally shared coffee with her during shift overlaps. He was a Vietnam veteran himself, and though they never discussed their service directly, there was an unspoken recognition between them. Lily Tran, a recent college graduate working reception, often sought Nina's advice on everything from career choices to relationship problems. Nina listened more than she spoke, offering quiet wisdom that came from perspectives these young civilians couldn't imagine. But the corporate trainers who used the facility were a different story entirely. They inhabited a world of buzzwords and power dynamics, of territorial behavior disguised as professionalism. The lead trainer, Ethan Blackwood, had built a small empire at Ridgeline. His leadership seminars commanded premium fees, and his client list included Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. At 42, Ethan projected the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. His expensive suits, perfectly styled hair, and practiced charisma made him the center of attention in any room he entered. Ethan's senior associate, Courtney Ashford, matched his arrogance with her own particular brand of condescension. A former corporate attorney who had transitioned into executive coaching treated support staff as invisible servants, existing solely to facilitate her convenience. She would snap her fingers to get Nina's attention, leave messes in conference rooms with the expectation that someone else would clean them up, and speak about facilities staff in the third person, even when they were standing right there. Justin Mercer, the third member of Ethan's training team, was younger and hungrier, eager to prove himself worthy of partnership in what he clearly saw as an exclusive club. He adopted his mentor's behaviors with the enthusiasm of someone still learning the rules, often going further than necessary to demonstrate his alignment with their attitudes. Nina's first encounter with Ethan's team came during her second week at Ridgeline. She had been setting up a conference room for an afternoon session when Ethan walked in with Courtney, deep in conversation about their upcoming seminar on leadership presence. "Excuse me," Nina said politely, stepping aside as they entered. "I'm just finishing the room setup. I'll be out of your way in 2 minutes." Ethan glanced at her with the brief, dismissive look people reserve for service workers. "Make sure the temperature is set to exactly 72 degrees, he said without preamble. "Last week it was 75, and several participants complained. Also, we need bottled water, not tap water in the pitchers. Evian or Fiji, not generic." "I'll make a note," Nina replied evenly, though the facility's standard protocol already included premium bottled water. Courtney walked to the presentation screen, frowning at the arrangement. "This screen needs to be exactly centered on the wall. It's at least 3 inches off to the left." Nina looked at the screen, which she had carefully positioned according to the room's specifications. "The screen is centered according to the wall measurements. The windows on the right side might create a visual illusion of, I don't need a lesson in visual perception," Courtney interrupted coldly. "I need the screen centered. Can you handle that, or do I need to speak with your supervisor?" The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. Nina felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to stand her ground warring with her newer instinct to avoid conflict. She thought about the aircraft carrier's flight deck, where every word she spoke carried the weight of life and death, where junior officers and senior enlisted personnel alike had respected her judgment without question. "I'll adjust it," she said quietly, letting the moment pass. After they left, Nina stood alone in the conference room, measuring the screen position with a laser level from her toolkit. It was perfectly centered, just as she'd known it would be, but she moved it 3 inches to the right anyway, because picking battles meant knowing which ones mattered. In the military, she had commanded respect through competence and rank. Here, she was learning that some people would never see past her position, never look closely enough to recognize what stood before them. That evening, as Nina locked up the supply closet and prepared to head home, she passed Ethan's office. The door was ajar, and she could hear his voice clearly. "Did you see the new facilities person?" he was saying, amusement evident in his tone. She tried to argue with Courtney about screen placement, as if she has any idea about presentation dynamics. Justin's laugh carried through the doorway. "These support staff always think they know better. My father used to say, people settle at their competence level. She's probably doing exactly what she's capable of." Nina kept walking, her footsteps silent on the carpeted hallway. The limp in her left leg was more pronounced by the end of the day, a reminder of the training accident that ended her career. The accident that happened because she had pushed back against a superior officer's dangerous decision and had been proven right only after the crash that nearly killed her. In her car, before starting the engine, Nina pulled out her phone and looked at the one photograph she kept saved there. Her squadron, standing in front of an FA-18 Super Hornet, all of them young and invincible and certain they were doing something that mattered. She wondered what Lieutenant Commander Garrett would think of the woman she had become, someone who adjusted perfectly centered screens because it was easier than explaining why she was right. But as she drove home through Charlotte's evening traffic, Nina reminded herself why she'd chosen this path. Invisibility meant peace. It meant no expectations, no pressure, no lives depending on her decisions. She'd had enough of being responsible for other people's safety. Now she just wanted to get through her days quietly, collect her modest paycheck, and try to forget the weight of the wings she had once worn. What Nina didn't know, as she pulled into her apartment complex and climbed the stairs to her unit, was the quiet anonymity she'd built so carefully was about to be shattered. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how carefully you cover it. And sometimes the people who dismiss you most readily are the ones who need the lessons you could teach them most urgently.
The stage was set. The players were in position, and Nina Garrett, who had once commanded the skies, was about to discover that some battles choose you, whether you're ready to fight them or not.
The catalyst arrived on a Monday morning in the form of a corporate-wide email from Douglas Pembroke, the CEO of Ridgeline's parent company. Nina was restocking conference room supplies when her phone buzzed with the notification. She almost deleted it without reading. These company-wide announcements rarely concerned facilities staff, but something about the subject line caught her attention. Elite Leadership Initiative, New Training Program Launch. The email announced an ambitious new program designed to train mid-level managers for executive positions. Ridgeline had been selected as the primary facility, and Ethan Blackwood's team would lead the curriculum. The first cohort would begin in 2 weeks, consisting of 20 carefully selected managers from the company's various divisions. The program would run for 8 intensive weeks, with participants spending Monday through Friday at the facility. What caught Nina's attention was the final paragraph. To ensure the program's success, all Ridgeline staff would be expected to contribute to creating an environment of excellence. This included facilities personnel who would be required to attend weekly coordination meetings with the training team to ensure seamless execution of the program's logistical needs. Nina felt her stomach tighten. Weekly meetings with Ethan's team meant increased visibility, more interaction, higher chances of conflict. She'd spent 2 months perfecting the art of staying out of their way, completing her work before they arrived or after they left. Now she'd be forced into regular contact with people who'd already made clear they considered her beneath their notice. The first coordination meeting was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. Nina arrived 5 minutes early, taking a seat at the far end of the conference table. She'd brought a notebook and pen, prepared to take down whatever requirements they'd have for the program setup. Frank had offered to attend in her place, but Nina had declined. Running from uncomfortable situations wasn't who she used to be, and she was tired of letting it be who she'd become. Ethan entered with Courtney and Justin, all 3 carrying leather portfolios and expensive coffee cups from the cafe down the street. They settled at the head of the table, Ethan in the center, establishing the clear hierarchy even in seating arrangement. "Let's begin," Ethan announced, not bothering with greetings. This elite leadership initiative represents a significant opportunity for Ridgeline. The CEO himself will be monitoring outcomes. We cannot afford any operational failures. He clicked open his laptop, projecting a detailed schedule onto the screen. Each day will begin at precisely 7 a.m. with a welcome reception. Fresh fruit, premium pastries, specialty coffee. I'm talking about an experience, not a continental breakfast. Participants are being groomed for executive positions. They expect executive-level treatment. Nina made notes, mentally calculating the logistics. 7 a.m. setup meant she'd need to arrive by 5:30 at the latest. Courtney took over, her voice crisp with authority. "Conference room A will be our primary space. The room must be reset each evening to exact specifications. I've created a diagram showing precise table arrangements, chair positioning, and materials placement. Any deviation will be unacceptable." She slid a packet across the table. Nina reached for it, but Courtney continued speaking as if Nina weren't there. "I'll need confirmation each morning by 6:45 a.m. that the room is properly prepared. A photo sent to my phone showing the setup will suffice. If anything is incorrect, there will be time for adjustments before participants arrive." "Daily photo confirmation by 6:45, Nina repeated, writing it down. Justin jumped in, eager to contribute. "We'll also need afternoon break service at exactly 2:30 p.m. Not 2:25, not 2:35. Leadership training is about precision and discipline. We're modeling these values in every aspect of the program." Nina looked up from her notes. "The afternoon break service, what specifically does that entail?" All 3 trainers looked at her as if surprised she'd spoken. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting he was being patient with a slow student. "Fresh fruit, premium pastries, specialty coffee. Standard hospitality service. Surely that's within your capabilities." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Nina felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. "Of course, I'm asking about specific preferences so I can ensure everything meets your standards. Courtney sighed audibly. This is exactly why I suggested we hire external hospitality staff for this program. Facilities personnel aren't trained in the level of service we're providing. I can handle it, Nina said quietly. Can you? Courtney's eyebrow arched. Because this isn't about restocking copy paper. These participants are being evaluated for positions that could determine the company's future direction. Every detail matters. Every interaction shapes their experience. We need people who understand excellence, not just adequacy. The implication hung in the air. Nina represented adequacy at best, certainly not excellence. Justin nodded in agreement, while Ethan watched with an expression that suggested he was already mentally composing his report about facility staff limitations. Nina met Courtney's gaze directly. I understand what's required. You'll have your morning confirmation photos. Your break service will be timely and precise. The program will run smoothly. Something in her tone, perhaps the quiet certainty that came from years of managing operations far more complex than corporate training, made Ethan pause. For just a moment, his confident dismissiveness flickered. Then it returned, stronger than before, as if he needed to reassert his authority. We'll see, he said. Understand that any failures reflect not just on you, but on this entire facility. The CEO has made clear that this program's success is a priority. There's no room for learning curves or excuses. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, each trainer adding requirements that seemed designed to be as demanding as possible. Custom name tags for each participant, replaced daily. Specific brands of water and coffee, room temperature adjusted throughout the day to match the energy level of different sessions. A detailed feedback form to be completed after each day, rating every aspect of the facility experience. When the meeting finally ended, Nina gathered her notes and stood to leave. As she reached the door, she heard Justin's voice behind her, not quite whispered. Think she can actually handle all that? She seems a bit overwhelmed. Courtney's response was audible enough to be clearly intentional. We'll find out soon enough. Some people are meant for support roles. It's not an insult, it's just reality. Not everyone can operate at our level. Nina kept walking, her footsteps steady despite the anger building in her chest. She'd once briefed admirals on combat readiness, coordinated with air traffic control while managing multiple aircraft in carrier landing patterns, and made split-second decisions that kept her crew alive in situations these corporate trainers couldn't imagine. And they thought arranging fruit plates was beyond her capabilities. In the supply room, Nina sat down heavily on a storage crate, her hands shaking slightly. This is what she'd tried to avoid, this feeling of being dismissed and underestimated by people who had no idea who they were talking to. Part of her wanted to walk into that conference room and lay out exactly what she'd accomplished, watch their faces change as they realized their support staff outranked anything they'd ever done. But the larger part, the part that still woke up with nightmares about the accident, about the lives that depended on her decisions, that part wanted to stay invisible. Because being seen meant being responsible again. It meant carrying a weight she wasn't sure she could handle anymore. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lily at reception. Hey, heard about the new program. You okay? Those trainers seem intense. Nina typed back, I'm fine, just another job. But as she looked at her notes, at the impossible standards and deliberate obstacles being placed in her path, Nina realized this wasn't just another job. This was a test, though not the kind Ethan and his team imagined. They were testing whether they could break her, whether she'd quit or fail, confirming their assumptions about where she belonged in their hierarchy. What they didn't know was that Nina had been tested in ways that made their petty power plays look like children's games. And she'd never failed a test yet. The Elite Leadership Initiative began on a gray Monday morning that matched Nina's mood. She'd arrived at 4:45 a.m., giving herself extra time to ensure everything was perfect. The welcome reception was arranged exactly as specified: fresh fruit, artfully displayed, premium pastries from Charlotte's most expensive bakery,
and 3 different types of specialty coffee brewing and commercial-grade machines she'd had to rent specifically for this program. By 6:30, Nina had photographed the setup from multiple angles and sent them to Courtney's phone. By 6:45, she'd received a terse response. Acceptable. Ensure the standard is maintained. The participants began arriving at 6:50, a mix of middle managers who carried themselves with the nervous energy of people aware they were being evaluated. Nina stayed in the background, refreshing coffee stations and clearing used plates with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected. Most participants didn't acknowledge her presence. She was part of the facility, like the furniture or the climate control system. Necessary, but not worthy of notice. Ethan made his entrance at precisely 7 a.m., commanding immediate attention. His opening remarks were polished and inspiring, talking about leadership presence, strategic thinking, and the qualities that separated good managers from great executives. Nina listened from her position near the coffee station, noting how easily he held the room's attention, how naturally authority seemed to flow from him. She'd known officers like Ethan in the Navy, charismatic leaders who inspired loyalty through personality rather than competence. Some had been genuinely skilled. Others had been dangerous, their confidence outpacing their judgment. She wondered which category Ethan fell into, though she suspected she already knew. The morning session ran smoothly until 10:15, when Courtney approached Nina with barely concealed irritation. "We're out of regular coffee. How did you not anticipate consumption rates?" Nina glanced at the station. 3 air pots sat there. 1 regular, 1 decaf, 1 specialty blend. The regular pot was indeed empty, but she'd prepared backup pots in the kitchen, exactly as planned. "I'll have fresh coffee out in 90 seconds, she said calmly. 90 seconds during which participants are without service. This is unacceptable. You should have been monitoring levels continuously." Nina had been monitoring levels. The regular coffee had been consumed at twice the rate she'd calculated based on the participation numbers. She could have explained this, but Courtney had already turned away, making a show of apologizing to a participant who'd approached the empty pot. By the time Nina returned with fresh coffee, a small crowd had gathered. She poured quickly, efficiently, ensuring everyone was served. As she finished, she heard Ethan's voice addressing the group. "Small disruptions like this are excellent teaching moments," he said smoothly. "In executive positions, you'll depend on support systems. When those systems fail, your leadership is tested. How you handle service failures reveals character." The implication was clear. The coffee situation was a failure, and Nina was the failure point. Several participants glanced her way, their expressions ranging from sympathy to mild contempt. She kept her face neutral, finishing her service and retreating to the kitchen. Lily found her there 10 minutes later, restocking supplies with more force than necessary. "That was completely unfair," she said hotly. "You had backup coffee ready. I saw you. This wasn't a failure." "It's fine," Nina replied, though her jaw was tight. "It's not fine. Courtney is making you look incompetent in front of everyone, and Ethan is using it for his stupid leadership lessons." Lily leaned against the counter, frustrated. "Why don't you say something? Defend yourself." Nina thought about all the times she had defended herself in the Navy, every instance where she had stood her ground against officers who questioned her judgment. She thought about the final time, when she'd pushed back against a training protocol she knew was dangerous and had been overruled. The subsequent crash had proven her right, but the validation had come at the cost of her career and nearly her life. "Pick your battles," Nina said quietly. "This one isn't worth fighting." But the coffee incident set the tone for the week. Ethan's team began treating every minor issue as evidence of Nina's inadequacy. When a projector bulb burned out during an afternoon session, Justin made pointed comments about equipment maintenance. When the afternoon break service arrived at 2:32 instead of precisely 2:30, Courtney filed a formal complaint about timing precision.
By Wednesday, the disrespect had become systematic. Ethan began referring to Nina as the help in casual conversation with participants. Courtney started leaving increasingly detailed and demanding notes about setup requirements, often contradicting previous instructions. Justin took to inspecting Nina's work each morning, looking for minor flaws he could point out publicly. The participants, taking their cues from the trainers, began treating Nina with similar dismissiveness. They'd leave trash scattered around break areas, speak over her when she tried to communicate about facility issues, and make requests with the expectation of immediate compliance, regardless of feasibility. On Thursday afternoon, Nina was setting up the conference room for the next day when 3 participants entered, discussing the morning session on executive presence. They didn't acknowledge her as she worked. "Blackwood really nailed that presentation," one said. "The stuff about commanding respect through confidence, that's exactly what I need to work on." "Did you notice how he handled that facilities issue this morning?" another added. "The woman forgot to reset the thermostat, and instead of getting angry, he turned it into a teaching point about grace under pressure." Nina paused in her work. She hadn't forgotten to reset the thermostat. It had been set exactly as specified in Courtney's notes. But someone had changed it before the session began, and Nina had been blamed for the discrepancy. The third participant laughed. "I don't know how she got this job. Seems like she struggles with basic tasks. Makes you appreciate good support staff when you have them." Nina finished arranging the chairs and left without a word. In the hallway, she passed Frank, who was replacing light fixtures. The older maintenance worker took one look at her face and shook his head. "Getting to you?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." Frank set down his tools. "Look, I've been working here 5 years. Blackwood and his crew, they've always been difficult, but this program has made them worse. They're performing for those participants, showing off their authority by putting you down." "I can handle it." "I know you can. Question is, should you have to?" Frank studied her with the knowing look of someone who'd seen too much. "There's handling it, and there's letting people treat you like garbage because it's easier than fighting back. 2 different things." Nina met his gaze, seeing understanding there. Frank knew about service, about hierarchy, about the complicated dance of maintaining dignity while being dismissed. But he didn't know the whole story. He didn't know why fighting back scared her more than the disrespect. That evening, alone in her apartment, Nina pulled out the photograph she kept hidden. Her squadron standing proud in their flight suits, the embodiment of confidence and capability. She barely recognized the woman she had been, so certain of her place in the world, so sure of her worth. Lieutenant Commander Garrett had never let anyone treat her with disrespect. She'd commanded authority through competence and presence. But Lieutenant Commander Garrett had also made decisions that got people hurt, had pushed too hard and crashed too far, had learned that being right didn't always mean being safe. Nina Garrett, facilities coordinator, had learned to be small and quiet and unremarkable. It was supposed to be safer this way. But as she looked at that photograph, she wondered if she'd confused safety with surrender, if invisible was just another word for erased. Her phone buzzed with an email from Courtney, marked urgent. Tomorrow's setup requirements had changed again, more demanding than before, clearly designed to create failure points. Nina read through the list, calculating times and logistics, recognizing the trap being set. She could quit, walk away from this job like she'd walked away from others when the weight became too much. Or she could keep enduring, keep absorbing the disrespect, keep proving that she could take whatever they threw at her. But a third option was starting to form in her mind, one that scared and excited her in equal measure. She could stop hiding. Stop pretending to be less than she was. Stop letting people who'd never been tested judge someone who'd been forged in fire. The question was whether she was ready for what that choice would cost.
The second week of the Elite Leadership Initiative brought a new level of calculated sabotage. Nina arrived Monday morning at her usual 4:45 to find the supply room lock had been changed. She stood in the hallway with her master key, which no longer worked, staring at the door that separated her from everything she needed for the morning setup. A maintenance request showed the lock had been changed Friday evening, authorized by Justin Mercer for security purposes. No one had informed Nina. No one had provided her with the new key. She called the security office, but they wouldn't arrive until 6:30. She called Justin's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. With setup due to be photographed and confirmed by 6:45, Nina had 30 minutes to find an alternative solution or face another public failure. She spent those 30 minutes borrowing supplies from other storage areas, improvising with what she could access, and setting up a reception that was functional but noticeably less polished than previous days. At 6:43, she photographed the setup and sent it to Courtney with an explanation about the lock situation. The response came immediately. Unacceptable. Professional facilitators anticipate obstacles. Your lack of preparation is concerning. When the participants arrived, Ethan made a point of commenting on the diminished quality of the morning reception. Standards matter in leadership, he told the group. When we accept less than excellence, we signal that mediocrity is acceptable. Notice the difference in today's setup versus previous days. That's the tangible result of lowered standards. Nina stood near the kitchen entrance, watching him use her sabotaged work as a teaching tool. Several participants looked uncomfortable with the public criticism, but none spoke up. Why would they? She was just facilities staff, and Ethan was the leadership expert they'd been sent here to learn from. At the morning break, Justin approached Nina with an expression of false concern. I heard there was an issue with the supply room this morning. I had the lock changed for inventory control purposes. I assumed someone would have provided you with the new key. The lie was smooth and practiced. Nina had worked in the military long enough to recognize calculated deniability when she heard it. I'll need that key, she said evenly. Of course, I'll have it sent down. He paused, as if considering his words carefully. You know, this program is really important to Ethan's career trajectory. The CEO is watching closely. Maybe if the logistical demands are too much, we could request additional support staff. No shame in admitting when something's beyond your capacity. The suggestion was clearly designed to sound helpful while actually being an ultimatum. Succeed under impossible conditions or be replaced. Nina met his gaze steadily. I can handle the logistics, just provide me with the tools to do my job. Tools? Justin's eyebrow raised. We're providing the same resources available to all facility staff. If you're struggling with basic access issues, that suggests a competency problem, not a resources problem. By Tuesday, the pattern had become clear. Every aspect of Nina's work was being systematically undermined while being framed as her personal failure. The afternoon break cart developed a broken wheel overnight, forcing Nina to carry supplies by hand and arriving 3 minutes late. Ethan made pointed comments on punctuality being a leadership fundamental. Conference Room A's climate control malfunctioned, making the space uncomfortably warm during the afternoon session. Courtney sent a scathing email copied to facility management about basic environmental standards not being maintained. The fact that maintenance had been called immediately and the issue stemmed from building-wide HVAC problems wasn't mentioned in Courtney's complaint. Wednesday brought the most blatant sabotage yet. Nina had carefully prepared the morning setup according to Courtney's specifications, including a specific arrangement of training materials at each seat. When she returned from the kitchen at 6:30, she found all the materials had been moved to incorrect positions. Courtney arrived at 6:40, took one look at the room, and called Nina over in front of early arriving participants. This is completely wrong, she announced loudly. I provided detailed diagrams. This placement makes no sense for the morning's activities. Nina looked at the materials, now scattered in the exact arrangement she'd been told to avoid. These were repositioned after I set them up correctly. Are you suggesting someone deliberately sabotaged your work? Courtney's tone dripped with condescension. That seems like a rather dramatic excuse for not following instructions.
I'm saying the materials were moved between 6:15 when I completed setup and now. Courtney glanced at the participants who were listening with obvious interest. Or perhaps you simply didn't understand the instructions. Not everyone has the attention to detail required for precision work. There's no shame in that, but there is shame in blaming others for your mistakes. Nina felt heat rising in her chest, the familiar anger that came from being gaslit by someone with more institutional power. She could argue, could insist on reviewing the security footage that would prove her right. But she'd learned that being right didn't matter when the person judging you had already decided you were wrong. She spent the next 15 minutes rearranging materials while participants watched, each one a witness to her supposed incompetence. When Ethan arrived and saw the commotion, he used it as an impromptu lesson on managing unreliable team members. In leadership positions, you'll often inherit staff who aren't performing at necessary levels, he told the group. The question becomes, do you spend resources trying to elevate them, or do you cut your losses and find better talent? There's a reason some people remain in support roles their entire careers. The message was unmistakable. Nina was the example of someone who'd reached their maximum capability, someone not worth the investment of development. Several participants nodded thoughtfully, absorbing this wisdom about human resources management. Lily found Nina in the kitchen afterward, visibly angry. "This is harassment! You need to report this to HR. They're deliberately setting you up to fail." HR works for the same company that's paying Ethan 6 figures to run this program. Who do you think they'll believe? Then quit! You don't need this job. You have a degree, experience, you could work anywhere. Nina thought about her modest savings, her medical bills from the accident still being paid off, her need for employer-provided health insurance to cover ongoing physical therapy. It's not that simple. It should be, Lily said fiercely. You're good at this job, better than good. The way you handle logistics, the way you anticipate needs, I've never seen anyone work like you do. And they're treating you like you're incompetent. The young woman's loyalty touched Nina more than she'd expected. Thank you, but I need you to stay out of this. Don't make yourself a target by defending me. That's exactly what they're counting on, Lily protested. Everyone's staying quiet while they bully you. She was right, of course. Nina had seen this dynamic in the military, toxic leaders maintaining power because good people chose silence over confrontation. She'd promised herself she'd never be that person, never stand by while someone was mistreated. But she'd also learned what happened when you stood up to power without sufficient backup. She'd learned that being right could cost you everything, that fighting battles you couldn't win just left you broken. That evening, Nina sat in her apartment reviewing the week's documentation. Every email from Courtney, every complaint filed by Justin, every public criticism from Ethan. A pattern of systematic undermining designed to force her resignation or justify her termination. She could quit, giving them exactly what they wanted, or she could endure, proving she could absorb whatever abuse they delivered. Both options felt like losing. Her phone rang, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Is this Nina Garrett?" The voice was male, official, vaguely familiar. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Colonel Raymond Shaw from Naval Air Station Oceana. I'm trying to reach Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett, formerly of Strike Fighter Squadron 143. We have a situation that requires consultation from someone with your specific expertise." Nina's breath caught. No one from her old life had contacted her in 4 years. "Colonel, I'm retired. Medical discharge. I'm not qualified to—" "You're exactly qualified, and we need you. How soon can you get to a secure line?" Nina looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built from the ruins of her military career. Then she looked at the photograph of her squadron, at the woman she used to be. "Give me 10 minutes, she heard herself say. As she hung up, Nina realized the universe had just presented her with an impossible choice. Return to the world that had broken her, or continue hiding in a job where she was being systematically destroyed by people who'd never faced real challenges in their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 4 years running from her past, and now her past might be the only thing that could save her future.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The secure call with Colonel Shaw lasted 40 minutes and changed everything. A training aircraft had experienced a catastrophic systems failure similar to the one that had ended Nina's career. The pilot had survived, but the incident had triggered a comprehensive review of training protocols. The Navy needed someone who understood both the technical aspects of the failure and the human factors that contributed to such incidents, someone who'd lived through it.
We've updated procedures based on your original recommendations, Shaw explained, the ones that were overruled before your accident. You were right, Commander. We need you to help us ensure we've covered everything. I'm not a commander anymore, Nina said quietly. You'll always be a commander to those of us who know what you accomplished. Shaw paused. I'm authorized to bring you in as a civilian consultant. 2 weeks, full access, significant compensation. The Navy takes care of its own, even when we failed to before. Nina had requested time to consider the offer, but she already knew her answer. The universe had just handed her a way out of her current situation with dignity intact. She could take a leave of absence from Ridgeline, do the consultation work, and return to find the Elite Leadership Initiative concluded. Ethan and his team would move on to their next project, and she could resume her quiet existence without them. But Thursday morning brought a development that complicated everything. Nina arrived at work to find an email from Douglas Pembroke himself, the CEO whose opinion determined Ridgeline's future. He would be visiting Friday to observe the Elite Leadership Initiative firsthand, and he expected to meet with all staff contributing to the program's success. The timing couldn't have been worse. Nina had planned to request her leave of absence today, giving the facility time to arrange temporary coverage. Now, leaving before the CEO's visit would look like abandonment at a critical moment. It might cost her the job entirely, eliminating any option to return. She was still processing this dilemma when Ethan intercepted her in the hallway. His expression carried something new beyond the usual condescension, something that looked almost like anticipation. "Good morning," he said with exaggerated politeness. "I wanted to personally inform you about tomorrow's CEO visit. Mr. Pembroke will be observing our afternoon session, and I've arranged for him to tour the facility operations as well. He's very interested in understanding all aspects of what makes this program successful." The emphasis on all aspects made clear that Nina's work would be under direct executive scrutiny. Ethan was ensuring she couldn't hide in the background while the CEO visited. "I understand," Nina replied evenly. "Everything will be properly prepared." "I'm sure it will. Though I should mention that Mr. Pembroke has expressed concern about some of the operational issues we've experienced. He'll likely want to discuss them with you directly. Just be honest about the challenges you faced. He appreciates candor." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Nina would be interviewed by the CEO about problems that had been deliberately created to make her look incompetent. Her honest explanations would sound like excuses. Any attempt to explain the sabotage would seem paranoid or accusatory. Either way, she'd be demonstrating exactly the kind of problematic employee Ethan wanted her to appear to be. "I appreciate the heads up," Nina said, giving nothing away. After Ethan left, Nina stood in the empty hallway, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in. She could contact Colonel Shaw and accept the Navy consultation immediately, abandoning Ridgeline before the CEO's visit. It would mean burning bridges, probably ending any future in corporate facilities work, but it would also mean escape. Or she could stay and face whatever judgment the CEO reached, knowing the deck was thoroughly stacked against her. Knowing that her silence about the harassment would be interpreted as complicity in her own failures. Frank found her there, reading her expression with the accuracy of long experience. "Bad news? CEO visit tomorrow. I'm going to be evaluated. And Blackwood's team has spent 2 weeks making you look incompetent. That's rough timing." Probably not a coincidence. Definitely not a coincidence. The older veteran leaned against the wall, considering. "You know, in Vietnam, we learned to recognize when enemy forces were setting up for a major offensive. There's a particular feeling to it, the way everything gets quiet before the storm. This feels like that."
Nina understood what he was suggesting. Tomorrow wasn't just a CEO visit. It was the culmination of 2 weeks of calculated positioning, with Ethan and his team preparing to demonstrate her inadequacy at the highest possible level. They'd been building to this moment, ensuring maximum impact when they finally moved to eliminate her. "What would you do?" she asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment.
I'd stop fighting their battle on their terms. You've been playing defense, trying to prove you can meet their impossible standards. But defense doesn't win wars. Sometimes you need to change the battlefield entirely. His words resonated with something Nina had been avoiding thinking about. She'd been so focused on enduring, on not making waves, that she'd forgotten there were other options. She'd forgotten who she used to be before the accident taught her that standing your ground could get people killed. That afternoon, Nina made her decision. She called Colonel Shaw and accepted the consultation offer, but requested a start date of Monday rather than immediately. Then she set about preparing for Friday with a level of precision and attention she hadn't allowed herself since leaving the Navy. If this was going to be her last stand at Ridgeline, she'd make it count. The Thursday afternoon session proceeded normally until 2:30, when Nina delivered the break service exactly on time. As she set up the refreshment station, she overheard Ethan speaking with several participants about the next day's CEO visit. Mr. Pembroke is particularly interested in operational excellence, Ethan was saying. He believes that leadership begins with the systems we create and the standards we maintain. Tomorrow will be an opportunity to demonstrate what we've built here. Courtney joined the conversation, her voice carrying clearly. We've certainly learned a lot about the importance of reliable infrastructure. Some challenges have been educational. The participants understood the implication. Nina was the challenge, the unreliable element that had provided educational value through negative example. Several glanced her way, and she met their eyes calmly before returning to the kitchen. Lily was waiting there, practically vibrating with indignation. I heard what they said. They're going to crucify you in front of the CEO tomorrow. Probably, agreed Nina. And you're just going to let them? Nina thought about the consultation offer, about the path back to a world where her skills were valued and her judgment was trusted. She thought about the woman in the photograph, the one who'd never backed down from a challenge, and she thought about Frank's advice about changing the battlefield. No, she said finally. I'm not going to let them, but I'm not going to fight on their terms either. What does that mean? Nina pulled out her phone and opened her email, composing a message to Colonel Shaw. It means I'm done hiding who I am. It means tomorrow, when the CEO asks about challenges, I'm going to give him honesty. Not the kind Ethan expects, but the kind that matters. She hit send on the email, then turned to Lily with something that might have been a smile. It also means you might want to make sure you're in the facility tomorrow afternoon. I think things are about to get interesting. Lily's eyes widened. What are you planning? I'm not planning anything, Nina said truthfully. I'm just going to stop preventing things from happening. There's a difference. That evening, Nina laid out her clothes for Friday with care. Not the usual casual facility staff attire, but the professional outfit she'd worn to her initial interview. She also placed a small item in her bag, something she hadn't carried in 4 years, just in case the universe decided tomorrow was the day for revelations. As she set her alarm for 4 a.m., giving herself extra time to ensure everything was flawless, Nina felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not quite anticipation, not quite dread, but something in between. The feeling of standing at a crossroads where all paths led to unknown destinations. Tomorrow, Douglas Pembroke would come to evaluate the Elite Leadership Initiative. Ethan would present his carefully constructed narrative about operational challenges and staff limitations. And Nina would have to decide how much truth she was willing to reveal, knowing that some truths once spoken couldn't be taken back. The phone call from Colonel Shaw had reminded her of who she used to be. Tomorrow would determine who she was becoming.
Friday morning arrived with unseasonable heat that made Charlotte's downtown shimmer in the early light. Nina arrived at 3:45 a.m., an hour earlier than usual, and found the facility already humming with unusual activity. Security had been doubled for the CEO visit. Additional catering staff had been brought in.
The parking lot designated for executive vehicles had been freshly repainted. Nina moved through her preparations with mechanical precision, checking and rechecking every detail. The morning reception was flawless, arranged with the kind of attention to detail that came from years of pre-flight inspections where mistakes could be fatal. She photographed everything from multiple angles, time-stamped each image, and sent the documentation to Courtney at 6:15. The response came at 6:45, quote, "Adequate. Ensure this standard is maintained throughout the CEO visit," end quote. By 7 a.m., participants were arriving, their energy different today, more performative, aware they were part of a showcase. Ethan greeted each one personally, his charisma turned up to maximum as he prepared for his audience with Douglas Pembroke. The CEO was scheduled to arrive at 1 p.m., observing the afternoon session before conducting facility tours and staff interviews. Nina had 5 hours to maintain perfection under circumstances designed to ensure she'd fail. The morning session proceeded smoothly until 9:30, when the first problem emerged. The climate control system began cycling erratically, alternating between too cold and too warm every 15 minutes. Nina checked the controls and found someone had switched the system from automatic to manual mode, then set conflicting temperature schedules that created the cycling effect. She corrected the settings, but the damage was done. Participants were uncomfortable, Ethan had to pause his presentation to address the issue, and Courtney sent a terse text, quote, "Environmental control problems on CEO visit day. Unacceptable," end quote. At 10:15, the coffee station situation repeated from the previous week, but worse. All 3 air pots failed simultaneously. Their power cords somehow disconnected behind the service station where Nina couldn't see them without moving the entire setup. By the time she discovered and fixed the problem, 15 participants had gone without coffee for 8 minutes. Justin appeared immediately, his concern theatrical and transparent. Another service disruption. On today of all days, Nina, if you're feeling overwhelmed, we can arrange backup support. "I'm handling it," Nina replied, but she could see participants exchanging glances, their doubt visible. The staff member who couldn't keep coffee flowing probably couldn't be trusted with more complex responsibilities. The real sabotage came during lunch preparation. Nina had arranged for catered meals to be delivered at 11:45, giving time for setup before the noon lunch break. The catering company called at 11:30 to confirm the delivery address, which they had been given as Ridgeline's old downtown location, the building the company had vacated 3 years ago. Nina checked her original order confirmation. The correct address was clearly listed. Someone had contacted the catering company and changed the delivery location, a fact the confused manager confirmed when Nina called back. Quote, "A woman called Wednesday afternoon said there'd been a location change," end quote. "She had your order number, knew all the details. We updated the address per her instructions." Nina had the lunch redirected to the correct location, but the delay meant food would arrive 15 minutes late. She called every nearby restaurant capable of emergency catering, but Friday lunch was peak time, and no one could accommodate a last-minute order for 25 people. When she informed Courtney of the situation, the response was immediate and brutal. Quote, "This is catastrophic. The CEO arrives in 90 minutes and we don't have lunch? This level of incompetence is exactly why we questioned your capabilities from the start," end quote. Ethan joined the conversation in the hallway, his voice carrying to nearby participants. "How does this happen? These arrangements were made a week ago. One task, confirm catering delivery, and somehow that's beyond your ability to manage?" Nina kept her voice level. "Someone changed the delivery address. I'm working to resolve it." "Someone changed it?" Ethan's tone dripped with skepticism. "Or you wrote down the wrong address and now you're creating excuses. Take responsibility for your mistakes instead of blaming mysterious saboteurs." The gaslighting was masterful, delivered with enough righteous indignation that nearby participants nodded in agreement. Of course there were no mysterious saboteurs. The simpler explanation is that the facilities coordinator made a mistake and refused to own it. Nina said nothing more. She'd learned that defending yourself against accusations of paranoia only made you seem more paranoid. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began preparing an alternative lunch from available supplies. transforming basic ingredients into an acceptable meal through skills learned from years of managing limited resources in military settings.
By 12:15, she'd assembled a credible lunch spread, presentation not quite as polished as catered meals would have been, but functional and professional. Participants ate with minimal complaints, though Nina heard several comments about the lunch situation that had apparently become another teaching moment about operational reliability. Douglas Pembroke arrived at precisely 1 p.m., emerging from a black town car with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He was 58, silver-haired, dressed in an immaculate suit that probably cost more than Nina's monthly salary. Two assistants flanked him, both carrying tablets and wearing the alert expressions of people prepared to document everything. Ethan greeted him with practiced warmth, launching into an overview of the Elite Leadership Initiative's success. Nina watched from her position near the kitchen, noting how Ethan's body language shifted in the presence of real power, becoming more deferential while maintaining his confidence. The afternoon session was a performance piece, with Ethan demonstrating the training methodologies that made his program so effective. Pembroke watched attentively, occasionally asking questions that Ethan answered with smooth expertise. The participants, aware they were being observed by the CEO, engaged with unusual enthusiasm. At 2:30, Nina delivered the break service exactly on schedule, her movements efficient and unobtrusive. She'd expected sabotage during this critical moment, but everything functioned perfectly. The realization sent a chill through her. They were saving their final play for when it would have maximum impact. At 3:15, Pembroke announced she'd like to tour the facilities operations. Ethan offered to guide him personally, a suggestion the CEO accepted. The group moved through various areas, Ethan pointing out features and explaining logistics while Pembroke's assistants made notes. They arrived at the conference room setup area, where Nina was preparing for Monday's sessions, despite knowing she wouldn't be there. Pembroke stopped, studying the organized supplies and systematic arrangements with an executive's eye for operational efficiency. "This is our facilities coordinator, Nina Garrett. She's been responsible for the program's logistical support," Ethan said, his tone carefully neutral. Pembroke extended his hand, surprising Nina with the gesture. "Ms. Garrett, I've heard your name mentioned several times today. I understand there have been some operational challenges this week." This was it, the moment Ethan had been engineering for 2 weeks. Nina could feel the anticipation radiating from him, from Courtney and Justin, who'd joined the tour group. They were waiting for her to stumble, to make excuses, to confirm everything they'd been suggesting about her limitations. Nina met Pembroke's gaze steadily, seeing intelligence there and something else, an openness to information that suggested he was more than just Ethan's audience. "There have been challenges, Mr. Pembroke. Some of them have been quite illuminating about organizational dynamics." Ethan shifted uncomfortably at her phrasing, but Pembroke's expression sharpened with interest. "Illuminating how?" "They've demonstrated how quickly narratives can form about competence and capability, and how those narratives can become self-reinforcing regardless of underlying facts. It's actually quite relevant to leadership psychology, which is my background." "Your background?" Ethan glanced at Nina with mild confusion. "I was under the impression Ms. Garrett was facilities staff." "She is," Ethan interjected quickly, "though she apparently has some academic credentials she hasn't mentioned." "I have a doctorate in organizational psychology, but credentials don't necessarily translate to competence in operational roles, as I'm sure has been pointed out during my time supporting this program." Pembroke studied her more closely now, his executive instincts clearly detecting something beneath the surface. "A doctorate in organizational psychology. That's interesting. What brought you to facilities work?" Nina felt the moment crystallizing, saw Ethan's expression darkening as he realized the conversation was slipping from his control. She could give a safe answer, maintain her protective anonymity, or she could do what Frank had suggested and change the battlefield entirely. Before she could respond, her phone rang. The ringtone was one she'd set 4 years ago and never changed, a specific tone assigned to military contacts. She had kept it as a reminder of who she'd been, never actually expecting to hear it again. Everyone looked at her phone. Nina glanced at the screen and felt her breath catch.
The call was from Naval Air Station Oceana, and suddenly the choice was being made for her.
Nina looked at the phone, then at Pembroke, then at Ethan's confused expression. I apologize, but I need to take this. It's from Naval Air Station Oceana. She stepped into the hallway before anyone could respond, her hand trembling slightly as she answered. Lieutenant Commander Garrett? The title came automatically after 4 years of civilian life, muscle memory from 1,000 previous calls. Behind her in the conference area, she heard someone, probably Justin, say, "Lieutenant Commander?" with obvious confusion. "Commander Garrett, this is Colonel Shaw. I apologize for the intrusion, but we have a development. The investigation has accelerated. The Secretary of the Navy wants your preliminary findings by Monday morning. I know we agreed you'd start then, but we need you this weekend. I'm sending a plane to Charlotte. Can you be at the regional airport by 1800 hours? Nina's mind raced. The Secretary of the Navy. A plane being sent? This wasn't just a consultation. It was a crisis requiring immediate response. The kind of situation where her expertise could save lives or prevent career-ending mistakes for officers who might not understand what they were dealing with. "Colonel, I'm in the middle of something here. Can you give me 30 minutes to arrange things?" 30 minutes. The plane leaves at 1800 with or without you, but I'm really hoping it's with you. We need you, Commander. Your country needs you. The line went dead. Nina stood in the hallway, phone still pressed to her ear, aware that the conversation had been loud enough for those in the conference area to at least hear her side of it. She turned slowly and walked back to face a scene that had transformed in her absence. Pembroke's expression had shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. Courtney looked pale. Justin appeared confused, and Ethan's face had gone through several emotions before settling on defensive anger. "Would someone like to explain," Pembroke said carefully, "why a naval installation just called my facilities coordinator Lieutenant Commander?" Nina met his gaze steadily. "Because that was my rank when I served, Mr. Pembroke. Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett, Naval Aviator, retired." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the facility seemed to pause. Pembroke's assistants had stopped taking notes, their tablets forgotten as they stared at Nina. "Naval Aviator," Pembroke repeated slowly. "As in fighter pilot?" FA-18 Super Hornet. 12 years of service, 3 deployments. Carrier qualified. Nina's voice was steady, almost detached, as if she were reading someone else's service record. "I retired 4 years ago after a training accident. Medical discharge." Ethan found his voice first, though it came out strained. "This is absurd. If you had that background, why would you be working in facilities?" "Because after you leave the military, especially after a medical discharge that ends your flying career, you need to figure out who you are when you're not the thing you've spent your entire adult life becoming." Nina looked directly at him. "I chose facilities work because it was quiet, uncomplicated, and didn't require me to be responsible for life or death decisions anymore." Pembroke was studying her with the intensity of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. The call mentioned preliminary findings. What investigation are they talking about? Nina hesitated, aware that what she said next would either validate her claims or make her look delusional. "There was a training aircraft accident similar to the one that ended my career. The Navy is reviewing protocols I recommended 4 years ago that were overruled before my crash. They want me to consult on ensuring the updated procedures are comprehensive." One of Pembroke's assistants was typing rapidly on her tablet. She looked up, eyes wide. "Sir, I'm finding news articles. There was a FA-18 training incident 4 years ago at Naval Air Station Lemoore. The pilot survived, but the aircraft was destroyed. The investigation report credited the pilot's emergency procedures with preventing fatalities.
It says the pilot identified a critical flaw in the training protocol 3 months before the accident. That was me. I identified the flaw. My commanding officer overruled my recommendations. When the accident happened, I managed to eject both myself and my weapons officer before impact, but my ejection was too low.
Shattered my left leg in 4 places. The injury ended my flying career, but we both survived. Courtney had been pale before. Now she looked genuinely sick. Justin had backed away slightly, as if distance could separate him from his previous behavior. But Ethan wasn't done fighting. "This is a very convenient story," he said, his voice tight. "Conveniently impossible to verify in the moment. Conveniently explaining away 2 weeks of operational failures." "You changed the supply room lock," Nina interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying new authority. "Tuesday, you or someone you directed contacted my caterer and changed the delivery address. Wednesday, you repositioned training materials after I'd set them up correctly. Thursday, you disconnected the coffee station power cords. This morning, you set the climate control to cycle incorrectly. Every operational failure you've documented was sabotage designed to justify the conclusion you'd already reached about my competence." The specificity of her accusations, delivered without emotion or drama, landed with devastating effect. Ethan's face flushed. "That's paranoid speculation." "Is it?" Pembroke's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Because from where I'm standing, Miss Garrett, or should I say, Commander Garrett, has just provided very specific allegations that should be easy enough to verify through security footage and phone records." He turned to his assistants. "Pull all security camera footage for this facility for the past 2 weeks. Also, request phone logs and email records for all training staff." He looked back at Ethan. "If there's nothing to hide, you won't mind the transparency." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words emerged that could save the situation he'd created. Pembroke returned his attention to Nina. "Commander, that phone call suggested you're needed immediately for a matter of national security importance. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. They're sending a plane. I need to be at the regional airport by 6 p.m. "Then you should go prepare." He glanced at his watch. "It's 3:30 now. You have 2.5 hours. He paused, seeming to make a decision. "When you return from your consultation, please contact my office directly. I'd like to discuss your career trajectory. A decorated naval officer with a doctorate in organizational psychology shouldn't be restocking coffee supplies, regardless of how competently you do it." Nina felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Thank you, Mr. Pembroke. Though I should mention, I was never incompetent at restocking coffee supplies. I was just doing it with one hand tied behind my back." A ghost of a smile touched Pembroke's face. "I'm beginning to understand that. Go. Serve your country. We'll sort out the details here." As Nina turned to leave, she passed Lily, who'd been watching from the hallway entrance with wide eyes. The young receptionist looked like she was witnessing something impossible, her expression caught between shock and vindication. Frank was there too, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. As Nina passed, he gave her a subtle nod, a warrior's acknowledgement of a battle well fought. In the parking lot, walking toward her car, Nina pulled out her phone and looked at the photographs she'd kept hidden for 4 years. Her squadron standing proud in front of their aircraft. For the first time since the accident, she didn't feel separated from that image. She felt connected to it, continuous with it. Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett had spent 4 years in hiding, trying to be small and quiet and unremarkable. But some things couldn't stay buried forever. Some identities were too fundamental to erase no matter how carefully you covered them. As Nina drove toward her apartment to pack for the weekend trip, Nina realized that the phone call from Colonel Shaw had not just reminded her of who she used to be, it had revealed who she'd always remained underneath the protective camouflage of anonymity.
And back at Ridgeline Corporate Training Center, Douglas Pembroke was beginning a very different kind of investigation than the one Ethan Blackwood had planned.
Nina spent the weekend at Naval Air Station Oceana, immersed in technical reports and accident investigations that reminded her of everything she'd been and everything she'd lost. The work was challenging, demanding, and deeply satisfying in ways her civilian life had never been. She briefed admirals, consulted with engineers, and provided recommendations that would shape training protocols for years to come. On Sunday evening, as she prepared to fly back to Charlotte, Colonel Shaw found her in the analysis center. "The preliminary report is excellent, Commander. You've identified 3 critical gaps we'd missed. The Secretary wanted me to convey his personal thanks." "I'm glad I could help," Nina said, and meant it. Shaw studied her thoughtfully. "You know, there's a permanent position here if you want it. Civilian consultant role, focusing on safety protocols and training enhancement. You'd be doing exactly this kind of work full-time. The pay is considerably better than facilities management." Nina thought about her small apartment, her quiet life, the careful anonymity she'd built. Then she thought about Douglas Pembroke's words. A decorated naval officer shouldn't be restocking coffee supplies. "Can I have some time to consider it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Nina landed in Charlotte late Sunday night and didn't check her phone until she was in her car. 17 missed calls, 34 text messages, 12 emails, all from Ridgeline staff, participants from the Elite Leadership Initiative, and several from numbers she didn't recognize. The most important message was from Pembroke's executive assistant, sent Saturday morning. "Mr. Pembroke requests you contact his office at your earliest convenience. Investigation has produced significant findings. Your presence will not be required at Ridgeline facility until further notice. You remain on full pay status." Nina called the assistant first thing Monday morning and was connected directly to Pembroke. His voice was grim, but satisfied. "Commander Garrett, I trust your weekend consultation went well." "It did, sir." "What's happened at Ridgeline?" "Justice, mostly." Pembroke didn't elaborate immediately. "The security footage was remarkably illuminating. We have clear evidence of Justin Mercer changing the supply room lock Friday morning. Video of Courtney Ashford rearranging training materials Wednesday after you'd set them up, and phone records showing someone from Ethan's office calling your caterer to change the delivery address." Nina absorbed this silently, feeling vindication and anger in equal measure. Pembroke continued. "What we also found in reviewing footage from the past 2 weeks was a systematic pattern of deliberate undermining. Coffee station cords disconnected by training staff, climate control settings altered, equipment tampered with. All of it documented, time-stamped, undeniable." "What happens now?" Nina asked. "Ethan Blackwood's consulting contract has been terminated immediately and without compensation for the remaining sessions. He's also been banned from all company facilities. Courtney Ashford and Justin Mercer are no longer employed by his firm. Last I heard, they're facing their own professional consequences. The Elite Leadership Initiative has been suspended pending a complete program review." The systematic destruction of the careers that had tried to destroy hers should have felt satisfying. Instead, Nina felt mostly tired. And the participants? They came here for training. "They received a very different education than intended," Pembroke said dryly. "Several have reached out specifically asking about you. Apparently, watching a decorated combat veteran handle 2 weeks of harassment with grace and professionalism while maintaining operational excellence taught them more about leadership than Blackwood's seminars ever could." He paused before continuing, his tone shifting. "I've been reviewing your background, Commander Garrett. MIT undergraduate degree, Naval Academy graduate degree, doctorate in organizational psychology from Stanford completed during your service, 3 Navy Commendation Medals, a Navy Achievement Medal, and a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. You didn't just fly fighter jets. You were being groomed for flag officer rank before the accident." Nina said nothing. Hearing her accomplishments listed made them feel both real and distant, like they belonged to someone else entirely. "Why facilities work?" Pembroke asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "With your credentials, you could have done anything."
"Because facilities work was simple," Nina answered honestly. "No lives depending on my decisions, no responsibility for other people's safety. After the accident, after the investigation, after watching my career end because I'd been right about something that nearly killed me, I just wanted to be someone ordinary. Ordinary? Pembroke tested the word. Commander, I don't think you understand what ordinary looks like. Ordinary people crack under the pressure you endured these past 2 weeks. They quit, they retaliate, they break down. You maintained excellence while being systematically sabotaged. And when finally given the opportunity to defend yourself, you did so with precision and professionalism. That's not ordinary. That's extraordinary discipline. What happens with the facility? Nina asked, changing the subject. That depends on you. Pembroke's voice took on a different quality, businesslike but with underlying warmth. I'd like to offer you a position. Director of Training Operations for all Ridgeline facilities across the Southeast. You'd oversee program quality, facility management, and operational excellence. It's a senior leadership role, appropriate compensation, and it would allow you to use both your military experience and your psychology expertise. Nina felt her breath catch. Mr. Pembroke, that's generous, but you're not sure you want to be back in a leadership position, he finished for her. I understand. The offer stands with no expiration date. Whether you accept it now, in 6 months, or never, you'll always have it available. There was a long pause before he added, though I should mention that several participants from the Elite Leadership Initiative have specifically requested that any future training include consultation from you. They want to learn from someone who's actually led under real pressure, not someone who just teaches theory. After the call ended, Nina sat in her apartment staring at her phone. 2 job offers in 3 days, both of them pulling her back toward responsibility and visibility she'd spent 4 years avoiding. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lily. OMG, everyone is talking about what happened. Are you okay? Are you coming back? Please say you're coming back. Another text followed from Frank. Heard Blackwood got what he deserved. Proud of you, Commander. Whatever you decide about the future, you won your fight. Nina walked to her bedroom and pulled out the photograph of her squadron. She'd kept it hidden for so long, ashamed of the person she'd been, afraid of the responsibilities she'd carried. But looking at it now, she saw something different. Not shame, but pride. Not fear, but strength. Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett had been someone worth being. Maybe it was time to stop running from her and start remembering what she'd learned. That afternoon, Nina drove to Ridgeline not as an employee, but as a visitor. The facility felt different already, quieter without the Elite Leadership Initiative participants. She found Lily at reception, who immediately launched into a detailed account of everything that had happened after Nina left Friday. It was incredible, Lily said, her eyes bright with vindication. After you left, Mr. Pembroke spent an hour reviewing footage right there in the conference room. Ethan kept trying to explain things away, but the evidence was so clear. At the end, he just left without even packing his office. Frank appeared from the maintenance corridor, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. The Commander returns. Should I salute? Don't you dare, Nina said, but she was smiling too. They walked together through the facility, past the conference rooms where she'd endured 2 weeks of calculated humiliation, past the supply room whose lock had been changed to sabotage her work, past all the small battlefields where she'd fought silent wars. What are you going to do? Frank asked. Nina thought about the Navy's offer, about Pembroke's offer, about the quiet life she'd built from the ruins of her military career. She thought about Ethan's words, some people are meant for support roles, and she thought about her response. Credentials don't necessarily translate to competence in operational roles. Both statements were true in their way, but neither captured the full truth. Some people were meant for leadership not because of their credentials or their roles, but because of how they handled themselves when everything was stacked against them. I'm going to stop hiding, Nina said finally. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I'm done pretending to be less than I am. Frank nodded, understanding in his expression. About damn time, Commander.
The following week brought a series of conversations that would reshape Nina's future. She met with Douglas Pembroke in person at the company's corporate headquarters, a sleek downtown Charlotte building that spoke of success and ambition. His office overlooked the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view that seemed to symbolize possibility. Thank you for coming, Commander, Pembroke said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I wanted to discuss the investigation findings more thoroughly and to understand better what happened at Ridgeline. Nina settled into the chair, noting the subtle shift in how he addressed her. Not Ms. Garrett, not the facilities coordinator, but Commander, a recognition of who she truly was. The investigation revealed something troubling, Pembroke continued. This wasn't the first time Ethan Blackwood's team had engaged in this behavior. We found complaints from previous facilities, whispers about toxic treatment of support staff, that were dismissed as personality conflicts. You were just the first person with enough resilience to withstand it long enough for the truth to emerge. Or stubborn enough not to quit, Nina said quietly. Resilience, stubbornness, determination. Call it what you will. The point is that you survived something designed to break you, and in doing so, you exposed a systemic problem we should have caught earlier. Pembroke leaned forward, his expression serious. I owe you an apology, not just as CEO, but as someone who built an organization that allowed this to happen. Nina hadn't expected the apology. In her military career, institutional failures were rarely acknowledged so directly. You couldn't have known. I should have known. That's the point of leadership, isn't it? Creating systems that protect people from abuse, not just systems that look good on paper. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. This is the formal offer package for Director of Training Operations. I've had legal review it, HR has inputted the details, and I'm prepared to offer you considerable latitude in how you structure the role. Nina opened the folder, scanning the numbers and responsibilities. The salary was more than 3 times what she'd been making in facilities. The benefits package was comprehensive. But it was the authority that struck her most. The ability to implement real changes, to protect others from what she'd experienced. There's also this, Pembroke said, sliding another document across, a formal letter of commendation for your service to the company, including specific documentation of the operational excellence you maintained despite systematic sabotage. It's being placed in your permanent record, and I've authorized distribution to anyone who might have been influenced by Blackwood's narrative about your competence. Nina felt something tight in her chest begin to release. Vindication wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about having the truth officially recognized and recorded. I need to be honest with you, Mr. Pembroke, she said carefully. The Navy has also made me an offer. Civilian consultant position focusing on training safety and protocol development. It would mean returning to work I'm deeply qualified for and an environment where my background is valued rather than hidden. Pembroke nodded slowly. That doesn't surprise me. You're exactly the kind of person they need. He paused, considering his words. I'm not going to tell you which offer to take, but I will say that sometimes the right choice isn't about returning to what was familiar, but about building something new from what you've learned. The insight struck home. Nina had spent 4 years trying to recreate a sense of purpose outside the military. Maybe the answer wasn't choosing between her old life and her new one, but finding a way to integrate both. Can I ask for something unconventional? Nina said. I'm listening. What if I accepted both? Split my time between the Navy consultation, which would be periodic rather than full-time, and building a new training paradigm for Ridgeline. Not traditional corporate seminars, but programs that combine leadership theory with real operational experience. Programs taught by people who've actually led under pressure. Pembroke's expression shifted to interest. You're talking about creating an entirely new model. I'm talking about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone, not just at Ridgeline, but anywhere. Creating training that teaches people to recognize toxic leadership, to build resilient teams, to maintain excellence under adversity. The things I learned from 12 years in Naval Aviation and 2 weeks being systematically undermined by corporate consultants.
A slow smile spread across Pembroke's face. That's ambitious. I spent 4 years thinking small. I'm tired of it. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, timelines, and possibilities. By the end, they'd sketched out a hybrid arrangement. Nina would serve as Director of Training Operations part-time while maintaining her Navy consulting relationship. She'd develop a new leadership curriculum based on actual experience rather than business school theory, and she'd have authority to personally vet any external consultants Ridgeline considered hiring. As Nina left Pembroke's office, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because all her problems were solved, but because she'd stopped running from who she was. Her phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Shaw. "Secretary approved your proposal for split duty. Welcome back to the Navy family, Commander. Part-time or not, you're one of us." That evening, Nina met Lily and Frank for dinner at a small restaurant near the facility. Lily was practically bouncing with excitement, while Frank maintained his characteristic calm, though his eyes showed pride. "So you're staying?" Lily asked hopefully. "You're not leaving Ridgeline?" "I'm staying, but in a different capacity, and things are going to change significantly." She explained the new role, the hybrid arrangement, the vision for transforming how Ridgeline approached leadership training. Lily listened with growing enthusiasm, while Frank nodded approvingly. "This is what should have happened from the beginning," Frank said. "Your skills being used properly, instead of wasted." "Nothing was wasted," Nina replied thoughtfully. "Those 2 weeks taught me things I wouldn't have learned any other way. How to maintain dignity under systematic attack, how to recognize the difference between legitimate criticism and calculated undermining, how to stand up for yourself when the entire system is designed to make you question your own competence." Lily's expression grew serious. "What happened to the participants, the ones from the Elite Leadership Initiative?" "Several have reached out. They want to continue their training, but with a different instructor. Pembroke suggested I might lead a modified version of the program, incorporating lessons from what they witnessed." "Will you?" Frank asked. She thought about it. About standing in front of the same people who'd watched her be humiliated, who'd absorbed Ethan's lessons about her incompetence. The old Nina would have declined, avoiding the awkwardness and potential judgment. "Yes," she said firmly, "because they need to understand that what they witnessed wasn't just workplace conflict, it was a masterclass in toxic leadership and institutional bias. If I can help them recognize those patterns and refuse to perpetuate them in their own careers, then something good comes from what happened." Lily raised her glass. "To Nina Garrett, who stopped letting people tell her who she should be." Frank raised his glass as well. "To the Commander, who remembered who she always was." Nina clinked her glass against theirs, feeling the weight of their words. She had remembered. But more than that, she'd evolved. The woman she was now carried both the strength of her military past and the wisdom of her civilian struggles. She was no longer Lieutenant Commander Garrett, trying to hide in civilian life, nor was she just Nina, the facilities coordinator, accepting disrespect as the price of invisibility. She was both, and neither, something new and stronger, forged in the space between who she'd been and who she'd tried to become.
6 months after the Elite Leadership Initiative collapsed, Nina stood at the front of Conference Room A, facing 25 managers who'd enrolled in Ridgeline's redesigned leadership program. The room looked different now, arranged for collaboration rather than lecture, with round tables instead of theater seating. The changes reflected Nina's philosophy. Leadership was something you practiced with others, not something performed for an audience. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the natural authority she'd once tried to hide. "I'm Nina Garrett, Director of Training Operations. Before we start, I want to tell you about the worst 2 weeks of my professional life." She proceeded to share the story of her experience with Ethan Blackwood's team, holding nothing back. The systematic sabotage, the public humiliations, the gaslighting, and deliberate undermining. The participants listened with varying expressions of shock, discomfort, and recognition. "Why am I telling you this?" Nina asked. Because most of you will eventually be in positions where you have power over people's careers and livelihoods. You'll make decisions about who gets promoted, who gets resources, who gets second chances. And you need to understand the difference between challenging people to grow and systematically destroying their confidence for your own purposes. One participant, a woman named Rebecca, who'd been quiet until now, raised her hand. "How did you not quit? I would have walked out after the first week." Nina smiled. "I almost did, multiple times. But I had spent 4 years running from confrontation, avoiding situations where I might fail or be judged. Those 2 weeks taught me that sometimes enduring is its own form of strength, and sometimes revealing who you really are is the only way to stop the abuse." The morning session covered leadership under adversity, using case studies from Nina's military career and her recent corporate experience. She taught them to recognize toxic patterns, to distinguish between legitimate criticism and calculated undermining, to build systems that protected vulnerable team members rather than exposing them. During the lunch break, several participants approached her with their own stories. A young manager who'd been systematically excluded from meetings by his supervisor. A senior analyst who'd watched her ideas be credited to male colleagues. A department head who'd been gaslighted into questioning his own competence by a toxic executive. "What did you do?" each of them asked in various ways. "How did you fight back?" "I didn't fight back," I told them honestly. "I maintained excellence despite obstacles. I documented everything. And when the moment came to reveal the truth, I did so with precision and professionalism. The best revenge isn't retaliation. It's demonstrating undeniable competence." That afternoon, Douglas Pembroke made an unscheduled appearance, observing the session from the back of the room. Afterward, he approached Nina with visible satisfaction. "This is exactly what we needed, real leadership education, not performance theater. The feedback from your first 3 cohorts has been extraordinary. Participants are implementing what they learn, and we're seeing measurable improvements in team dynamics across multiple divisions." Nina felt pride at the validation, but more than that, she felt purpose. "We're just getting started. I've been consulting with the Navy on adapting some of these principles for military leadership training. The lessons translate across contexts." "How's the Navy work going?" Pembroke asked. "Challenging and rewarding. Last month, I briefed the Chief of Naval Operations on training protocol reforms. The recommendations I made 4 years ago, the ones that were overruled before my accident, they're now standard procedure across naval aviation. It's satisfying to know that my experience, painful as it was, is preventing future accidents." Pembroke studied her thoughtfully. "You've changed since that Friday when everything came out. You carry yourself differently." "I stopped pretending to be smaller than I am. Turns out that takes a lot of energy. Energy I can now use for things that actually matter." Later that week, Nina received an unexpected email. It was from Tyler Chen, one of the participants from the original Elite Leadership Initiative, the program that had collapsed so spectacularly.
"Commander Garrett," he wrote, "I wanted to reach out because I've been thinking a lot about what happened during those 2 weeks. I was one of the people who laughed at Ethan's jokes about you. I accepted his narrative without questioning it. Watching you maintain professionalism despite everything we now know was happening, it taught me more about leadership than anything Ethan actually said in his seminars. I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I'm working to be better. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." Nina read the email twice, then crafted a careful response thanking him for his honesty and encouraging his growth. She didn't mention that his apology was one of only 3 she'd received from the 25 original participants. Most people preferred to forget their complicity in someone else's mistreatment. But 3 apologies were 3 more than she'd expected. 3 people willing to acknowledge their role and commit to doing better. That was progress. On Friday evening, Nina met Frank and Lily at their now regular dinner spot. Lily had been promoted to executive assistant, her talents finally recognized by leadership who actually valued competence. Frank remained in maintenance, content with his role but enjoying the facility's improved culture. "Heard you made another manager cry this week," Frank said with amusement. "Thompson from accounting?" Nina winced.
He wasn't crying. He was emotionally processing. There's a difference.
He was definitely crying, Lily confirmed. But in a good way? He told me afterward that your feedback session was the most valuable professional development he'd ever received. I just told him the truth about his leadership blind spots. He's brilliant with numbers, but terrible at reading people. Once he understood that, he could start addressing it. The old Nina would never have been that direct, Lily observed. The old Nina was too busy hiding to help anyone. The old Nina, the lieutenant commander version, would have been direct but probably too harsh. Current Nina has learned to balance honesty with compassion. Only took 38 years and a complete career implosion to figure it out. Frank raised his glass. To Nina Garrett, all versions, past and present. They drank to that. 3 unlikely friends brought together by circumstances that should have broken them, but instead made them stronger. The following Monday evening, Nina was preparing materials for the afternoon session when her phone rang. Unknown number, but with a Virginia area code, she answered cautiously. Commander Garrett? This is Admiral Rebecca Morrison from the Pentagon. I've been reviewing your work on training protocol reform, and I'd like to discuss a potential project. How would you feel about helping redesign leadership development for the entire naval aviation community? Nina looked around her office, at the photographs on her desk, her squadron in one frame, her Ridgeline team in another, both representing versions of herself she no longer had to choose between. She thought about the journey from that morning 6 months ago when Ethan Blackwood had dismissed her as incompetent support staff, to this moment when admirals were calling to request her expertise. I'd be honored, Admiral. When do we start? As she hung up, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Not younger or older, but more present, more solid, more completely herself. Lieutenant Commander Nina Garrett never really disappeared. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to reemerge, stronger for the hiding, wiser for the struggle, ready to lead again. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't about defeating your enemies. They were about refusing to let your enemies define you, about maintaining your integrity when everything was designed to break it, about remembering who you were even when everyone told you to be someone else. Nina Garrett had learned that lesson the hard way, and now she was teaching it to everyone who'd listen, one honest conversation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.